Good morning. Are you all excited? We have to get this place electrifying. So that means we need a very higher pitch. Are you excited? Let's try for the final time. More louder than before. Are you excited? Great. It is an incredible privilege to be the moderator for this session. This is one part of the series of panel that we have here at the 2024 Oxford African Conference. Before we start, let's give a round of applause for the organizers. Such a phenomenal job getting everyone here. Today we are leading a panel focused on one of the most critical issues in Africa. That has to do with democracy, and that also has to do with leadership. Um, this is very close to my heart because governance challenges in Africa is a crucial part of our development. Around Africa, we're seeing challenges on youth inclusion in political leadership, navigating around the progressive world or democratic pillars become a critical part of agreement and disagreement in Africa. A lot of issues, a lot of ideologies, a lot of conversation, a lot of polarization as well. And I think this is the right space, the right stage to set up this entire conversation. As the moderator, I have the privilege to introduce our distinct panelists, some with exceptional experiences in governance, some with diverse leadership role in African continental issue, firebrand intellectuals, and I think we will have some of the most frank conversation about our continent. As I come to the stage, I would like to first welcome Senator Edwin Sifuna. Please give him a round of applause. Thank you. Yes, anyway. Next, I want to welcome Honorable Fatoumata Nijai. Next, I want to welcome Mr. Mudo Jallo. Mudo Jallo is here. And then finally, I want to welcome Kate Oregon. So as you know, I purposely did not introduce them because I want them to be the architect of their own introduction. And they can best display their leadership, their experience, and their background. So as we begin this panel, welcome. Welcome to the Oxford African Conference 2024, a panel on navigating democracy, dynamics, contemporary African issue. Today, our panel will explore the intricate landscape of governance and democracy in Africa, aligning with the OAGIN team, Charting Africa Path Forum, or Journey of Possibility. Our discussion will actively provide questions surrounding the challenges and opportunities for fostering good governance in Africa. Key topics include democratic institutions, political stability, the rule of law, effort to combat corruption, promoting transparency, and among other issues. Our panelists will draw from successful governance model, relevant to case study, offering nuanced approach and insight into the dynamic forces of Africa's democratic evolution. The objective of this panel is just primarily one key aspect, providing a comprehensive understanding of the complexity involved and to contribute to valuable perspective, fostering effective governance, sustainable democratic practice, and paving the way for Africa's future possibilities. So we'll start with Senator Sifuna. Just give her a brief background, who is Senator Sifuna, and relatively to the topic, how do you envision this conversation? 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Wanto. As you heard, my name is Edwin Sifuna. I am the Secretary General of the Orange Democratic Movement Party in Kenya, which is one of the largest political parties in East Africa by following. And I'm very happy of the theme of and the colors of this conference because those are the colors of my party. Therefore, I'm very comfortable with everything, including the conference material that is decked in the colors of my party. I am a first-time senator in the Parliament of the Republic of Kenya. I was elected in the 2022 general election to represent the county of Nairobi, which is the capital city, and I welcome you. Every time you land in Nairobi, you should be able to claim very credibly that you know me. And from the airport, all you need to say is you know me, and your life will be a bit better. I am also the deputy whip of the minority side in the Senate. I turned 42 years old on Wednesday. I am married to an environmental lawyer who has been the pillar of my life. And also, you know, she was the head of prosecution, prosecuting wildlife crimes at the Kenya Wildlife Service for 8 years before she herself was poached, forgive the pun, by an American-based NGO that does wildlife work as well. And so these days she helps to grow the capacity of wildlife agencies across Africa. She has worked in Namibia, she has worked in Tanzania, and in Botswana as well. We have one daughter, she turns 8. When she's asked what is the thing she says the most to her father is goodbye. Because of my work, I'm always leaving home, including last week, but she's fine. So that is me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Great. Next on, we will take Honorable Fatumata Ninjai.
Thank you, Wanto. My name is Honorable Fatuma Sanjai. I'm a member of parliament in the Gambia. I am an independent candidate, was expelled from my party for being the person that I am. I am a mother of 3 children. And most importantly, I say I'm a mother of a sick child who suffers from sickle cell and who just managed to graduate with a first-class degree in economics. So as women leaders, we are not only leaders, we are also mothers. A graduate in politics and international relations, which I thought was accidental because my parents wanted me to study law. But as a stubborn child, I enrolled myself in politics and international relations because I wanted to be an international diplomat. And I think I am an international diplomat for women now because I stand for everything that a woman should be. I want to be remembered as the woman that was, the woman that stood up for every woman, a woman that voiced out what every woman thinks of but is afraid to think of. I think that was why I was expelled from my party, because I stood up for what I believe in. And it is a privilege. And I would say thanks to Isa too for making me come to this event. I'm not feeling well today. I have a chest infection, but it would have been a great mistake not coming. Thank you, Oxford.
Okay, and following Honorable Ninjai, we'll have Maldo Jallo.
Thank you. I think I love the way you said following, because how do you follow those two introductions? I honestly, I feel like going back and sitting on that side and watching at this point. What do I say about myself? I think quite simply, I've had a career both within government, advising government, or just writing and analyzing government. So my whole career up to this point has been about understanding how governments work, why do they have the challenges that they have, and how you can create transformative change through government. Because I think it's very easy to take the position that governments don't work, politicians are untrustworthy, the public sector is useless. But I think that's really where transformative change happens. Because if everyone, think about it, if everyone went to the public, if everyone went to the private sector, a lot of the things that we take for granted would just simply stop working. And I think the better public services we have, the better public sector we have, that's when you really see the most vulnerable and the poorest in society actually have a better life. Because that is truly where I believe, anyway, change happens. So we cannot neglect it. So I could, and many of us in this room could work in the private sector, but I have chosen, maybe I'm crazy, to continue to believe in the public sector and to believe that actually you can have outcomes that are the best for everyone in the public sector. So that's what my career has been about so far. If you want to know more about what that looks like, my LinkedIn is a very interesting place to be sometimes. So you can check that out. But I'll stop there because, again, frankly, I just don't know how to follow the two previous introductions. So maybe what I say later might be more interesting.
Sure. Great. Thank you. And then finally, we have Kate Oregon.
Thank you very much. And my name is Kate O'Regan. I am a former judge of the South African Constitutional Court. I was appointed immediately following the transition from apartheid to constitutional democracy in 1994 by President Nelson Mandela, and was one of the first 11 members of the court that served for 15 years, which was a maximum term. Our court can only serve for 15 years from 1994 to 2009. I do feel that having grown up during apartheid and being involved to some extent in the struggle against apartheid, it injected me always with a sense of hope. It's very difficult when you've seen a transition that we didn't think was possible for most of our lifetimes to happen. And I think that's an important sense that I carry forward, even in a world which can look very difficult. Currently, I'm leading a research institute in human rights here at the University of Oxford, the Bonavera Institute of Human Rights. We have a particular interest in work in the Global South, particularly South Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we read human rights broadly to include democracy, governance, the rule of law, and respect for the international legal system. So I'm really honored to be here today. Really look forward to the conversation with this very distinguished panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So now that you've had like a synopsis of what this panel entails, we want to kickstart with tough talking questions. I was in Kenya recently for the 2024 United Nations Civil Society Conference. We organized a youth panel focused on Africa 2063. And this is where my question to you, Senator Sifuna, start with. Considering the African Union Agenda 2063, Senator, what are the most critical governance indicators that Africa countries who have succeeded with? And what will you specifically give as an examples to a shift in governance?
Well, thank you, Wantu. I hope you enjoyed your time in Nairobi. First of all, Africa faces various challenges when it comes to governance. And the easiest examples I can give are the examples from my own country. That in fact, there is a feeling amongst the populace that there is no accountability between or from the people that hold power. One of the most interesting things that we did when we were putting together our new constitution in 2010, there was something that was introduced, a clause to recall members of parliament. This is a very serious accountability tool that in fact, if you were to vote for Sifuna as the senator of Nairobi, having pledged certain things, and if along the way during the term, I deviate or become somebody other than the person that you met and voted for, it was very possible for you to initiate this process of recall. But what the members of parliament in the first parliament after the election of 2013, when the new constitution came into power did, they made it impossible for a member of parliament to be recalled by introducing all sorts of loopholes, and you have to jump through hurdles and hoops and all sorts of things. So it has become impossible. And one of the biggest manifestations of this is that when it comes to policy decisions on the floors of the House, you will see members of parliament voting against objectively things that their constituents would never allow them to vote. And the voter has no recourse in terms of how they can be able to hold that member of parliament to account. We have suggested, because one of the things that I experienced going into parliament, when you get into that place, it's like a bubble. It's very secure. There's a lot of security. You know, even if people are shouting out there on the roads, they cannot access you. And one of the suggestions we made that during critical votes, we want those votes to be taken in the constituencies, in town halls, in front of the people themselves. So they say, if there is a tax measure to be imposed, yes or no, can you vote in the presence of your people and not in the safety of parliament? So the accountability mechanisms have been lost, and it has led to this feeling amongst the population that in fact there is no way to hold the people in office accountable. Another thing is that successive governments, you get into power and you express all these good things, but they have not shown the respect for the constitution they found and the tenets of democracy, the rule of law. We have had very difficult experiences in Kenya where you have regimes that do not support basic freedoms. You have had, for instance, in Kenya a few years back, last year actually, we had street protests, and very many people actually lost their lives. Our position is that nobody needs to die in a protest because it is a constitutional right. You have seen outside Oxford, there's a peaceful protest going on for those who support the Palestinian cause. Nobody needs to die in those tents. And we were joking yesterday, if those tents were in Nairobi, the commissioner of police would have come with a bulldozer and mowed those tents down. Because although our constitution expresses a right for you to assemble peacefully and freely, the people who find themselves in power don't always respect that. And those rights are, accountability rights. They help to ensure that there's proper governance in any country, that you can ask questions of the people in authority, you can present questions, you can show your displeasure and discontent in the manner in which your country is being governed by some of these things. Lastly, on the question of respect for the rule of law, one of the biggest frustrations is that it is possible for you to obtain a court order in Kenya, and that court order remains a piece of paper. And yet, the constitution expresses, I was very happy in South Africa. I think some of the things that you've put in place are working. I was very happy. I saw that there was a decision of the Constitutional Court barring somebody who had been sentenced to 15 months in jail from running in an election. I doubt that would ever happen in Kenya, because we have had our own challenges with the sort of caliber of people who end up in power. So we have a lot of challenges, when it comes to governance in Kenya, governance in Africa generally. And it is the biggest impediment. I was hoping that my party leader, Honorable Raila Odinga, would express at least one line on why Africa, with all these resources and all this potential, is not able to roar like the lion that he described. It is because of bad leadership. And that is the one thing that we have to sort out as Africa for that lion to roar.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So with this question to Honorable Njai, you definitely stand out on this panel as a symbolism of women leadership in political process. With this, in our African countries, there's a patriarchy norms when it comes to the inclusiveness of women into political leadership. With the current Africa 2063 agenda, the objective is as vast as clear, ensuring that there is an increasing threshold for women inclusivity. What successful strategy and initiative do you think that we can implement to achieve this?
Thank you. I think typically women within patriarchal societies are encouraged to be communal, to focus on domestic and family matters. That's not a bad thing, because when we focus on that, we raise good leaders. And when we raise good leaders, we strengthen democratic values in the world. So what we need to change to make sure that it reflects directly to what the world needs, to give those women and even men, because when we raise them, we don't only raise women. If we raise men to know the value of women, then it makes a difference, and they would accommodate the values of women in leadership. In my country, I hear people say that she is just a woman. And I think that needs to change. That word just needs to be taken out of the conversation. They are just men. Yeah, we are just human. She is just a woman, because when I speak my mind, and then someone would say, don't mind her, she is just a woman. And that woman can change the world, because she can say things that can stop a war. In Africa, we were privileged to have the very first democratically elected female president. The West were not able to give the world a first democratically elected female president. And that was in the form of Madame Salif, who happens to be my mentor. And if she can, why can't we? What did she change in the world? She stopped a war in Liberia, and she reversed the mindset of the Liberians to respect the value of life. And what did she do? She stood up and decided to fight the men and change the status quo. So what can we do to change that patriarchal mindset? Is to say no. Yes, we can. And with that in our minds, it is what you believe in. If you say something and don't believe in it, sometimes I take up my laptop and start searching for a job. And then I tell myself, if I stop what I'm doing, it means I'm running away. And what happens to that young girl that looks up to me? Not only that young girl, to that parent that looks up to me. If their child would want to do the same thing, they would say no, because she ran away. So don't do it, because you won't be able to. And that is what we need to change. We need to change the mindset of the people to be able to break that patriarchal barrier that stops us. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I love the fact you mentioned President Salif. I'm from Liberia, so that's my former president. um, with this question that it is closer to me, we have the projected highest population in the world when it comes to young people, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Hugely, the African Development Bank and the World Bank projected that if Africa must project itself as a global superpower, tapping on its youthful population is a critical pillar of change. And with this question, I would like us to, have the perspective of Mauro Jallo. When it comes to youth inclusion in political leadership, one thing you say in your opinion that was very critical is playing an informal and a formal role into political leadership in an advisory or maybe in direct political engagement. With this, how do you think we can be able to tap on more inclusive political participation of young people in our current status quo?
Um, so I'm assuming everyone in this room, this is not sort of your first time coming to a conference like this, correct? I mean, who's here sort of the first time you've been to a conference like this? Please put your hand up. Okay, there's just one. So you've heard a lot of the stuff that you're going to hear before, right? So what am I going to say to you that is different, right? And I always think about that when I come to places like this, because I think I don't want to waste your time. So I'm going to be very honest, right? The way in which our world is designed, and we live in a capitalist society, right? In 95%, 98% of countries around the world are capitalist societies, right? You have your North Koreas, but we won't go into that now. So the accumulation of capital equates to power. That is true in the business world. Fortunately or unfortunately, it is also true in the political world. And the longer you are alive, the more chance you have to accumulate capital. Therefore, young people are inherently at a disadvantage because they haven't been alive long enough to accumulate the capital that they need in order to be politically powerful. I could sit here and talk to you about, oh, we can create youth advisory boards. So, and she's someone that I know and she's an acquaintance, so I'm not disparaging, but, we can create the AU youth, envoy and things like that. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the critical decisions that are actually going to move the needle, young people are still not included. And that's not something that I'm sitting here and saying, oh, why are we not included? No one's going to give you power. Power isn't, read any book you want about power or look at history. When have you ever seen a time where Caesar was like, you know what, I've had enough time. Let me pass it over to some other people. It rarely happens. So young people are not going to be given power. So then you have two options. You either take it, which personally, I'm not one for the standing on the street and protesting. So I'm not going to say that. What I would urge you to do is try to understand, how does power work? How can I gain that power? And what is it in my control that I can do to get some of that power? And that gets you to a completely different mindset where you're not complaining, where you're not sitting and thinking, because like you said, a lot of the time when protests happen, the politicians are inside, they don't hear you. So that is an option, but let's put that to the side for a second. And let's focus on two things. One is, by understanding the dynamics that take place in the places of power, you're then able to say to yourself, well, I saw that senator did this and this and this, and that's how he was able to get there. Maybe I should learn from that, and maybe I should get some mentorship so that I know what happens behind the scenes. Because a lot of young people think, oh, if I take a few pictures, put them online, if I'm seen to be protesting about a certain topic, I might be able to be politically viable. That's not really how it works. That's one side of it. You don't know about all the handshakes that you have to do in rooms, in the side rooms. So this main room that we have here is what people focus on, right? But the side events, when someone says something and then you go up to them and you speak to them and say, hey, I'd love to have 5 minutes with you to understand how this works. If you take that and multiply it by 100, Honorable Odinga is standing here. By the way, he's 79. I don't know if people realize that. He did not, and correct me if I'm wrong, when did he go into politics? Right. So people see that and think, oh, he's the former prime minister of Kenya. He has so much support. They think it's easy. It is not. I'm also from the Gambia, by the way. So my sister here was expelled from her party for saying something that she believed in. It's not a walk in the park, guys. Power to people, power means everything to people, and they're willing to do anything. And unfortunately, in our part of the world, even kill.
Mhm.
Are you ready for that? Is the question you need to ask yourself. So if you're not, then someone is. And unfortunately, in the game of power, whoever is willing to do what is necessary, I don't need to finish that.
Great. Around Africa, and thank you so much for that contribution. Around Africa, the rule of law and governance is a very interesting conversation. And we have Kate Oregon, who has a background with the African Charter on Human Rights. She also has a background on the working with the African Code on Human and People Rights, and a lot of work on election governance. So with this question, I would definitely like your perspective on corruption. There's a saying that corruption undermines democracy and governance. And so we want to know, like, with your experience and background, what are specifically, indicators that will transform our current barriers to ensuring accountability, human rights principles, the rule of law, in all of these institutions you work with? Okay.
Well, thank you very much. And obviously, corruption is an enormous worry and damaging to democracies in many ways, not only because it diverts public funds that should be spent on public needs. And across our continent, we have so many needs where the scarce public monies need to be spent, but also because it destroys trust in the system. The senator's spoken about the trust in the system. It makes people think that political leaders are there only to serve their own interests, their own private interests, and that damages our democracies and the project of democracy right across the continent. There's no simple answers as to how to deal with this. Some of it is about building a public culture and political culture, which is that the purpose of public service is public service and not self-enrichment. That there are many people on the continent who believe in that. There are many people who are struggling for that, but it's a slow process. It's not something that you establish over time. South Africa, of course, has had its own long process of trying to deal with problems of corruption over the last 30 years. Some of you will have followed the issues around state capture in South Africa, the establishment of a commission of inquiry headed up by our current outgoing Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, where an enormous amount of work was done to investigate the ways in which corruption had been used. Effectively, the idea of state capture is that people who were paying politicians were also controlling core state decisions. And that Commission of Inquiry has reported and has made a lot of recommendations, many of which have not yet been accepted. So there's no easy answer to that. But I do want to just say one or two words about institutions, if I may, because we've talked a lot about power and leadership, and these are two very important elements of building a strong democratic Africa. But another really important element is strong institutions. And I will say that, somebody who studies and is concerned about institutions across the continent, I think we've seen some really significant strides in the last decade or two. The senator has spoken about the Kenyan constitution and the role of the Supreme Court in Kenya. It's been a strong court in many ways. And of course, courts don't always get things right. As a person who sat on a court myself for 15 years, I know it's very hard to get the answers right. But the point about building strong institutions in which people have faith and trust is that it's a way of holding power to account. It's not perfect, but it is an important way of holding people to account. And I want to mention a little bit here the African Court on Human and People's Rights, following on what Honorable Raila Odinga was talking about the importance of thinking continent-wide. The African Court on Human and People's Rights, which many of you may not know about, is a court that's set up under a protocol established by the African Union, based in Arusha in Tanzania. And it adjudicates cases that come before it, referred either by states or in relation to a handful of countries by peoples and individuals. It not only adjudicates the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, but something which I think is a global leader in rules around democracy. That's the African Charter on elections, governance, and democracy. It's actually the other way around: democracy, elections, and governance, which the African Court has held falls within its remit. This is a really important charter, which I think if all of us knew about and all of us sought to protect, used as a guideline, it would be an extremely important document for the continent. The African Court has picked up on it. It's issued some important judgments on this in relation, I think most importantly, to the independence of electoral commissions. The court has really been willing to put itself on the line to say electoral commissions need to be independent. This is an important part of building institutions, building confidence and trust in democracy.
Great. Thank you. Let's give a round of applause for our...
Can I just say something about something that Modo brought up? And I have a fairly different view of things, because sometimes, Modo, I feel like the political class does a lot to try and scare young people from participating in politics. He paints a very grim picture, and they say, oh, politics is a dirty business. You need all this amount of money and experience and all sorts of things. From my perspective, I think it is deliberate to try and scare young people from participating in politics. My own experience is that I was appointed the SG of Raila Odinga's party at the age of 35. I was still a youth by the definition in the Kenyan constitution. This is a position I've held for the last, this is the 7th year now. But young people must show interest in politics. Before I became SG, I was interested in politics back in 2002 when we were at the university. I studied at the University of Nairobi. We were kicking out a party and a government that had been in power for over 20 years. We were the young people running and singing in the streets of Nairobi about the possibility of a new Kenya, a new chapter in the history of our country. So it is possible that for as long as young people get interested in politics, it doesn't have to take 40, 30 years. And I'll give you the examples of Senegal. We have somebody who essentially ran a campaign of 2 weeks, and they are the president now. But it has to find you prepared as young people. Number two, we always say that, sorry for two. We always say that for young people, there is nothing special about being young, by the way, because all of us get to be young at some point. We don't all get to be old. We all get to be young, even if it is just for a day. So there is nothing special about youth. But what do you bring to the table? I always tell young people the story of on the day that you are appointed the Secretary General of a national party like ODM, and then you have a meeting. Tomorrow you have this big rally in the center of Nairobi, and Honorable Odinga looks at you and asks you, what are we telling the country tomorrow? You have to have the answers. You have to be prepared for it. So you have to have something you bring to the table. Many of the young people in Kenya, they say they don't draw a direct correlation between politics, governance, and their own lives. So they think that government and politics is something that they can easily ignore, that they can just fly under the radar. Until you find a bunch of old people who sit in that air-conditioned parliament that I was speaking about, passing a law introducing taxation on the money that you're making from your TikToks. And then suddenly you realize the government does not follow you on Instagram, but they follow the money you make on Instagram, you know? So a lot of young people are having those conversations now. You must show the interest in politics to be able to engage and to participate. As a leader of a political party, I have been so frustrated in getting young people to even just register as voters. It is very frustrating. It's so difficult because they don't draw that parallel between their lives and the policymakers and the people that end up in power. But I think we're going to have greater success now that there is a Instagram tax. And then when it comes to voting, I mean, if you will need motivation to register as a voter, it means essentially on the day of election, I have to drag you out of your house to come and vote. And I am one of those people who's now advocating for mandatory voting in Kenya, because it is the only way that we are going to have proper participation of young people in elections. So, Wanto, let me give you the grim statistics. We have a population of, say, 55 million people. And as Raila Odinga said, 70% of those people are between the ages of 18 and 35. That is how big it is. And it is reflected even on the register of voters. But they don't show up to vote. You know, they don't show up to vote. So if these people really wanted to make a change, it is very possible for them to make a change and to see that if you don't see a reflection of yourself in the elected representative, if your member of parliament does not look like you, they don't think like you. I can assure you. There is no way they will get your lifestyle. So you have to show up and to be able to participate in these elections. Lastly, I want to just demonstrate, Fatu, that in fact across the continent, these notions about women and leadership are changing. I'm a very proud SG of ODM. We were the first major political coalition in the last election to put a woman on the ticket as the deputy president of the Republic of Kenya. It was the first time it was happening. In my own political party, all the constituencies that had women incumbents, they were protected from party primaries and they were given direct tickets so that you grow the number of women that you have actually gotten elected into the houses of parliament. So even basic handicaps for participation in elections for young people and for women and persons with disabilities start at the very point of registration as a candidate. It can be very prohibitive that if a young person wants to run even for a council seat, they have to pay the equivalent of maybe 130 pounds just to register as a candidate or as a member of a political party. What we do in ODM is we try to remove some of those hurdles. We waived registration and nomination fees for all female candidates running in single constituencies in the last election to try and encourage people to run. And all these scary stories you hear about politics, how difficult and gruesome the campaign is, how much money you need. For me, from my perspective, I think it is the political class just trying to scare people from participating so that they can remain in their own small club as the people who run politics. So I want to encourage young people, especially those Kenyans who are here, come back home and run for office and and show us and show us all these things, nice things that you are learning here at Oxford, implemented in policy. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so with the next question, I also want us to really appreciate Honorable Fatumata, who came regardless of the fact that she's not well. Let's please give her a round of applause. With this question, we'll have just 30-minute response for this, because then we have a couple of questions that I want to look at to close this panel. There's a famous African parable that says a great dancer knows when to leave the stage. In Oxford, if you delay too much, people will walk out. Time is very important. So with the questions and answers, you can definitely scan this and ask your question, and I will, I'm so sorry that we'll not get all of the question, but we'll select. If your question is part of the lucky few, we'll be very happy to. And after this panel, our goal is to have a post-panel conversation. The panelists will be available to talk to you on their experience and to capture a couple of things that we may not be able to capture on this panel. So in 30 minutes, African 30 minutes, Honorable Fatumata, I definitely would love to hear a bit about Gambia. In terms of you serve in the assembly, what are some of those constitutional measures that you have provided or may have seen that promote transparency and accountability that will be very important for an African case model?
Thank you. When it comes to democracy in the Gambia, I think we've shown the world in 2016 that being the smallest country, one of the smallest countries in Africa, we can overcome autocracy because we removed a dictator of over 2 decades in 2016 democratically. Notwithstanding, it was another missed opportunity. It only shows that removing a dictator would be creating another dictator without strong institutional structures. So legislative measures that are critical to ensure democracy stays are good anti-corruption laws, because they encourage transparency and accountability. Without accountability, we cannot contain democracy. Because what happens when you become a leader, people see you as a demigod. Yeah, that is what happens in Africa. We have seen in the United Kingdom, they have changed prime ministers time and time because of lack of accountability. And lack of accountability brings distrust to the people. And if the people do not trust you, they will not trust the system. And if there are good institutions, because of that lack of trust, it calls for change. But in Africa, those things do not happen. So we need to have good legislative laws. Recently, I'm serving my second term. In my first term, we fought for our parliament to be truly autonomous, because we are supposed to have 3 arms of state: the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. But in effect, the executive overshadows all the 3 arms, and it doesn't bring transparency or accountability. And we had to fight to be autonomous. You cannot do oversight functions over the executive and expect them to fund you to do that oversight. It gives you, there's a nuance that stops you from doing oversight, because if the finger that feeds you, if you are supposed to do oversight in the finger that feeds you, then you will not want to stay hungry. You have to enhance that finger and you give them more power. So what we have done, we have set up the Human Rights Commission in the last 5 years in the Gambia, and that enhances accountability and the defense of human rights in the country. Because from what we have seen, lack of human rights brought what happened in from 1994 to 2016. Gambia has been the foundation of democracy. In 1986, the African Center of Human Rights was established in the Gambia, because from independence in 1965 to 1994, Gambia had been the beacon of hope in Africa. We were termed as one of the only West African country, with the exception of Senegal, that had never experienced a coup d'etat then until 1981, and it was a failed attempt. Until 1996, Gambia was the beacon of democracy in Africa. We had very good laws, but they were not implemented because of tolerance, because of the interaction of culture, tradition with our democratic values. But post 2016, we established the Human Rights Commission. We had passed the Access to Information Act. We had an attempted constitutional amendment, which also failed again because of the lack of the political will and lack of good governance in the country, because those were the changes that we envisaged in 2016, and those were the campaign promises that we made. But then again, because of the lack of good leadership, what you promised in 2016, and they gave you the mandate to fulfill those promises, you relented on those promises and went back to what we fought against. At the moment in Gambia, there has been no positive change post 2016. If you look at the parliament, the leader of the parliament now in Gambia was the majority leader when we had autocratic leadership post 2016, and the leadership is not elected. If it was elected, it would have shown a democratic drive. But the leadership is nominated by the president. Why would a president relent from the promises that they made to the country and brought back what we've so hard fought against to get to rid ourselves of? I think that is the lack of accountability, because you cannot hold him accountable for bringing back what we fought against. And that is why we established the Anti-Corruption Act. That is why we established the Human Rights Commission. That is why we passed the Access to Information Act. And with Access to Information Act, we are obliged to set up an Access to Information Commission, because that gives right to every Gambian. When there are laws, when there's any information, it must be published as it comes out, and the commission should make sure that those things are implemented. The only way we can do that is to have strong institutions. Without strong institutions, we cannot enhance political stability, hence entrench our democratic values in the region. Post-Jammeh, Gambia had an opportunity to reshape these institutions and governance, but again, it was a missed opportunity. And like I said, political actors especially need to demonstrate greater sincerity and be prepared to adopt collaborative and consensus-building approach with the citizens. If they are not engaged, they will not again have trust. Somebody mentioned, I think Modu mentioned lack of trust. But there will be lack of trust if it's not inclusive.
Great. We'll come back to that again. Very great contribution. So I mentioned Africa in 3 minutes, so I think that's the reason why we are seated. So right now, out of Africa, 3 minutes. So the next question is definitely to Jalo. You know, I'd love to talk about your experience with the Tony Blair Foundation in terms of when it comes to international organization on engaging governance programs in Africa. It's a controversial topic, especially if you have international organizations dictating to what governance should be like. With your experience, what specifically do you see in this as opportunities and challenges for governance in Africa?
I don't. So the work that we do is not really in governance. on the African continent. I think we mostly focus on sort of economic development and look at sort of sectors and so on. So I think what I'll do is I'll take your question, but answer it from the standpoint of someone who has worked not only with the organization that I'm with now, but across the board. So I've been on different advisory boards and things like that. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to leave people with something that they can take away with. So I think there are two main points there. So the first one is, if you look at statistics, so according to Afrobarometer, which is widely recognized as a sort of a tool for understanding sentiment across the African continent, 75% of Africans want open and honest leadership and believe in democracy. 50% of Africans actually strongly hold this view. So I want to dispel the narrative about how Africans are somehow predisposed to autocracy, or like we actually prefer autocracy. We don't. I think the reason there's a lot of I think support, and in my personal view, misguided support for autocracy across the continent, especially in places like the Sahel, is people thought that democracy was going to bring outcomes. They haven't seen a lot of those outcomes. Therefore, they want something different. Now, as misguided as that is, it's understandable. Humans will look for alternatives if what they have now is not working. So that's why you see a lot of people embracing autocracy, embracing disinformation, which I believe has led to the support that you see in places like the Sahel for military coups. The track record on military coups, if you go back and look at your history, is not very good when it comes to when it comes to sort of outcomes, both economic and also democratic, but also in terms of just general good governance, right? In the beginning, there's a lot of euphoria, there's excitement, the uniforms, the rhetoric, we're going to change this, we're going to stop the exploitation. But then give it a few years, and then ask the same questions again. It never holds up, because these people are not trained to run countries. It's a completely different skill, right? So for me, I want to leave people with that, which is 75% of Africans actually want democracy. It is a misnomer to think that we don't. The second point is this. When you look at the last sort of 10 years or so, across the world, not just in Africa, you see that there's been a change in how democracies are being run, but also how people attain power within democracies. Now, if I could sit here and start a movement just by maybe getting someone to sit in front of me with a camera, I say a few things that I think are popular, it goes viral. Next thing you know, I'm a front runner in an election. I may have no idea how I'm going to run the country, but that's gotten me to the position of power. Now, as you said, when Raila Odinga turns to you and says, what are we going to tell the country? You have to be ready on day one. People don't have time, especially nowadays. Everything is 100 miles per hour. People are not patient. If you come to power and you don't have a plan on day one, you're dead in the water. And it's actually something that a lot of people celebrate, but I think it's actually a bad thing. The rate of re-election for incumbents across the board has plummeted. Before, for a lot of political economists, it used to be a thing where you would know that, okay, if an incumbent is in power and nothing drastic has happened, there's no sort of serious war, no famine, no issue, 9 times out of 10, they'll get reelected. That's not the case anymore. That's not because all of a sudden, governance is so much worse, and that's why, no, it's because people are judging politicians differently, which is creating new incentives for politicians, which is why instead of politicians focusing on building a road that takes 5 years, I'd much rather go viral on TikTok, because then, that helps my polls, right? But that doesn't run a country. The room went really quiet. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to like make it really, but I guess the key point in all of this, and sorry, is democracy is about us. It's not about the leaders. If we don't give the leaders incentives to be good leaders, they're not going to be good leaders. That is as simple as that. And it is our job as people within democracies, whichever country you're from, even people in the UK, because this is a global phenomenon, to be more serious, as you said, about politics. Politics is not something that you can ignore. It's not a genre, right? It's not. It's not a thing that you watch on TV and say, like, oh, I'm not into politics. What do you mean? It's all around you. And it impacts your life on a daily basis, whether you know it or not. And like you said, I keep quoting the senator because I think he made a lot of great points, which is don't wait for an Instagram tax to become politically active. Because before the Instagram tax, there was the increase in energy prices you may not have felt because maybe someone else was paying for it. There were, things that were agreed to, trade deals that are going to impact you 20 years from now that you have no idea about. If you're not active, politicians will continue to get away with what they're getting away with, and you'll continue to complain, and nothing will change.
Great, thank you. And the final question before we switch to few of the slides. This question has to do with very great issues in Africa. The aspect of term limit, which is a constitutional issue. Increasing wave of coup d'etat across African continent have come from the desire for increasing presidential term in different part of African countries. And I think this impede on our desire for democratic leadership that is purely driven by political values, the rule of law, and the majority and decision of the people. With your experience, Kate, how do you think, Africa as a continent can implement guaranteeing term limit constitutionally?
I mean, term limits are very important. And I suppose one of the things to realize about it is that built into democracy is a kind of process of uncertainty. In some ways, if you've got a leader you really like and you think is doing a good job, it sort of seems natural to say, well, let's give them a longer term. But the problem with that is that it stops the pipeline of young leadership, of new leaders coming through. So although there is a bit of a natural tendency to say, well, why should we change when we've got something working? One's got to realize that democracy builds in this process of change and transition. And for most human beings, change and transition is uncomfortable. So it's not only about political leaders who want an additional term. It's quite often all sorts of people around them think, well, that's why we should stick with what we've got. It's the known quantity, etc. But actually, by doing that, you are actually destroying this pipeline of kind of managed uncertainty, which is what democracy is. So I think in thinking about term limits, it's important to realize why sometimes people think that they think a third term is a good idea. But in terms of actually managing term limits, of course, it is now the trend across all new constitutional frameworks to write in a term limit to constitutions. Most constitutions do impose a term limit of 2 terms. There's sometimes a debate if there's been a change in constitution as to whether a third a term is possible, but that's generally what happens. And what then happens, and this was something that happened in Africa across the first post-colonial constitutions, the incumbents want to change that. And again, we are seeing this issue coming before courts, and courts in some parts of Africa, it's also happened in Latin America and in other parts of the world, have sometimes said, no, you can't change the constitution. 2-term limits is required. A 2-term limit is required. So, courts are an important protector there. But the real thing is actually understanding the politics of why we want democracy and realizing that although there may be arguments for a third term, actually to do that is to probably kill off democracy. And one's sometimes got to get rid of a leader who may be doing a good job, but it's time for change. And I think one of the other factors, and we're seeing this not only in Africa, I mean, look at the United States, we're seeing the problem of elderly leaders. And I say that as somebody myself who's quite elderly and was subjected to a term limit, which I think was a good thing, is that actually it's really important. And it comes back to your points. We really want to see young people moving into politics. We want to see that pipeline of leadership. And so it's all very well putting it in the Constitution, putting it in the law, hoping courts will protect that. But more important than all of that is making sure that political culture protects that. That is, as people, we insist on that because that's the strongest protection for not ending up with leaders for life.
Great. Let's give a bigger round of applause for our panelists. So I have very interesting questions. Very interesting questions that we have here, and I'm gonna go with the first one. This one is directed directly to Senator Sifuna, and I found it very interesting. So it says, I've been standing. Let me say directly with the panel interact. So this one says, in Africa, we elect those who campaign with food and leaves out those who campaign with ideas. And the logic of social economic transformation. What are your ideas? And I think anybody could chip in with that too as well. Very interesting. Campaign with food and leave out ideas. So African left free food.
No, it's not necessarily that they lack free food, but the economic situation of our people has been such that it is very easy for the people who are moneyed, the people who have resources, to essentially take advantage of the poor. It is an incentive. If there is a political rally happening somewhere, your family has not eaten, and you know that you will live there with a packet of maize meal, you are more likely to attend that political rally than to stay at home. So we have to have a broader conversation about the corrupting influence of money and resources when it comes to leadership and to elections. I was having a supper yesterday with some Kenyans. I think Ruth was there. And one of the things that I was telling them was that until and unless the people themselves change the criteria for why they elect people, from the person who has given me that one packet of maize meal to the person who actually has ideas, I think Africa as a continent will not change. Anybody can become famous on TikTok, but not everybody can rule. And if democracy is the expression of the popular will, it sometimes will produce unintended consequences, because it is very easy for bad people to be popular. And we have seen it across the world. And on that day one, as he was talking, he is not prepared to govern, but he has the most followers on TikTok. All his videos go viral because of all the insane things that he says. I was at a conference in Germany of political parties that call themselves liberal political parties. And there was almost 40 political parties represented there. And in the room, the moderator looks across and he tells us, do you people realize you call yourselves the good people, but there's only one political party in this room that is in power back home. The rest of you have been losing elections. You need to learn to win elections. And unfortunately, the conclusion was that the good people have to start learning how to be bad. That was that was the conclusion. Because you look across the world, it is just the bad people getting elected into power. It's as if that there is something that has happened to the human beings. The people with the craziest ideas are the ones that are leading in the polls. I will not mention any countries that are going to the elections this year, but it is looking very grim for the good people. So it is something to have a conversation about. What is the criteria that we employ or apply before you can make somebody a president? Number two, leadership must be grown. Leadership must be grown. And there is an objective way of establishing the capacity of someone to lead. The history of someone is important, is critical. We have said in Kenya, if you have a history of repression, somebody who's more likely not to respect constitutional orders, somebody who's, a centralist, somebody who believes in amalgamation of power as opposed to dispersal of that power and devolution of power and resources. If you are a person who's likely to believe that only you out of a population of 55 million people has the ideas to govern forever, so you are challenging term limits and thinking about constitutional changes, that you are somehow special, then your history should disqualify you. You don't need to go to the constitutional court to be told that this is a person likely, when they get into power, to try and hang on to power, So the public, the voting public, must be encouraged to review the criteria why, or for why they elect certain people to certain positions. Our constitution tried to define it. The 2010 constitution tried to define and set a leadership criteria that you have to be suitable for the office that you are seeking for, and then have personal integrity, and you should be qualified for that role. But the politicians, again, went and watered that down to remove those 3 essential ingredients for leadership from elective office and replace it with popularity. And that is where we are.
Great. Thank you for that response. So you want to chip in?
Yeah.
Okay.
When we talk about the food, I always ask myself, because I've done 2 campaigns, and in the last couple of years, I won my elections and I won an election for a mayor, both being in opposition, without the resources, without the food. What we turned the ideas into food, because we asked the question, where is the food coming from? What is the alternative? It's either the food for a day, 5 years, with 5 years of bad governance, or the food used into another alternative to create more food for 5 years. So I think the trajectory in Africa is now changing. We've seen it in Senegal. In my country, we've seen opposition taking urban areas, urban cities, and those are the most conscious voters. And if government starts losing urban cities, it's a cause for concern. It shows that people are conscious. They don't want the food anymore. They want the ideas. They want to see development. They want progress. We've seen Senegal, 10 days out of prison. There was no time for food at that time. So what do we need? We need to turn ideas into food, because that gives the mind the life that it needs. I think Africa, there is hope. I always see the glass half full, not half empty. The beacon of hope, I think, is still alive.
Thank you. So we are out of time. So for expediency, what I'm going to do is we'll give 1 minute of closing to all of the panelists, but we're going to start with for Kate and then come here. Just 1 minute of closing because we're out of time.
Well, thank you very much. I think that in closing, I absolutely agree that we should think hopefully. There has been a lot that has happened over the last 10 or 15 years on the continent about which there is much to be hopeful and proud. There are also other things, and it is worrying what's happening in Sahel. But I think the other thing to remember is that strong democratic systems depend on people in each country. And it's important to engage with people, to try to make people realize that this is in fact a civic responsibility we all bear. I'm interested in the response to your suggestion, Senator, that we should have compulsory voting, which is rare in many parts of the world. But I've often thought, you know, President Mandela, when he came out of prison, shocked everybody by saying he thought we should give the vote to 12-year-olds. I can't remember if it was 12-year-olds or 14-year-olds. But I have thought that giving the vote to people who are 16, for whom the world really matters and their futures really matter, at a time when they're still at school, when you can start having proper civic education about what it means to have the vote, might in fact be a very important step forward to get youth realizing what politics is about and why it matters to them. But beyond that, thank you very much for having me on the panel.
Great, thank you.
I think a good place to end would be to look at 2 elections, the one that just finished and one that's coming up. So South Africa coming up and Senegal that just finished. So I promise I'm not angling for a sponsorship deal by Afrobarometer, but they just have great data. So they followed Senegalese people's sort of opinions of the Electoral Commission and looked at also sort of their opinions of democracy. So in Senegal, so I mentioned across Africa, it's 75% that believe strongly, well, 50 that believe strongly in democracy, 75% that want open and honest and transparent democracy. In Senegal, that number is also quite high. It's in the 60s. But at the same time, even though they believe in democracy, in the last few months before the election, in February, the last time they did the survey, the hope in sort of the Electoral Commission dipped to 48%. In my opinion, that was a coup waiting to happen if the incumbent had looked for a third term. And we saw that happen in Guinea, right? Because when you see a situation where people believe in democracy, they want democracy, but then they don't get the outcomes that they want, and at the same time, they don't believe in Electoral Commission, it means that they're not going to respect or trust the outcome of the election. And especially when someone's running for a third term, I don't know. I'm not, I can't say for sure. But for me, in my analysis, that was a coup waiting to happen. And thank God that there was a change in government, because then we don't have to deal with that sort of situation. So that's my sort of thoughts on what just happened. In terms of what's coming, South Africa is always a very difficult country to analyze. And I tried to, but I think the key thing to look for in that election is this. You have an unusual situation where the same party has been in power for over 30 years, right? Well, 30 years actually. And it's not because they've stayed in power forcefully or they've been elected each time. People went out each time and voted for the same party for 30 years. For the first time, you've seen polling that's dropped below 50%. It's about, depending on who you speak to, is about between 45 to 50%. If South Africa goes into the election and votes for the ANC at below 50%, it's going to be super interesting to pay attention to for two reasons. One is which coalition is going to be formed. And that tells you a lot about, sort of where the ANC is going. So, I don't need to go into that, but, if they end up forming a coalition with certain parties, we should all be worried. But then second, and more importantly, is there's a whole new generation of South Africans who don't really remember apartheid. Or as
model, let's
yeah.
just summarize, Chris.
Sure, yeah. So that is going to be very interesting to see how they vote. So just leaving you with that, if you want to look at that in the coming days and weeks, it'll be really interesting.
Sure. 1 minute, please. Then we have 2 minutes, and that's done. Yeah. Just 1 minute closing, and then
Thank you. I said here that I'm ambassador for women, so but technically I'm an international diplomat for women. So my closing would focus on the level of representation in women. It is quite low. And at this rate, it will take us 130 years to achieve parity. It is a cause for concern because without more than 50% of the global population included, the world will not move, and that is where I will stop. It leaves you to think about how to get women involved. We need to get women. I think 2024 is a very crucial year. At least 11 African countries will go into elections this year. What do we need to change? We need to change the narrative. Thank you.
Thank you. I can see one to looking at me like you don't need to say anything. Time is up. African democracy is not perfect, but what is the alternative? If it is autocracy, I think we need to still work on this democracy until it works for us. We in Kenya are in a very unique position. We have experienced both autocracy and we have tested democracy. Honorable Raila Odinga here served 2 stints in detention without trial during the times of autocracy. Three. Actually, it's reminding me, there were 3 stints, a total of 9 years, I believe. And he's one of the lucky few who actually came out alive. People were killed, people were maimed. And for us, really, as a generation, we keep reminding ourselves that we never want to go there. So with its imperfections, I think democracy is the better option for us, and we need to keep working on it until it works for us. Secondly, for our friends from the West, of Africa, I think there is this notion that coups only happen with guns. In Kenya, we have the specter of electoral coups, that you can actually vote for someone and somebody sitting somewhere ensures that your vote doesn't count. We have experienced it ourselves in Kenya. So it is not just coups that you see soldiers in the streets carrying guns. That specter of coups happens even in elections. And it has happened repeatedly in Kenya, and we need to work to perfect that system, because elections matter, and election outcomes also matter. And we have to encourage people that their voice must be reflected in the outcome. And that is why in Kenya we have another fight for electoral, you know, there is a fight to actually ensure that elections produce the results that were intended by the population, and not the specter of people imposing themselves under the guise of elections in our continent.
Right.
I thank you.
Thank you. So guys, we want to appreciate all of you for listening to this panel, but then the half-year appreciation goes to the leadership of the Oxford African Society, President Satu and her team. Let's give them a round of applause. So we've come to the closure of this panel. We are so sorry that we couldn't take all of the questions. Our panelists will generously have conversation with everyone, all of you, and together we can be able to chart a better future for Africa. Thank you.